In his reply to Lee, John Lachs wants to focus on 6 flaws that he finds in Lee's argument. First, Professor Lee thinks that values are objective. That is, he thinks they're independently existing realities. In reply, Lachs says, the good is not like the seashore, ready to be visited and loved. Second, Professor Lee supposes that there is a single uniform human nature. He says this by saying there are certain basic goods and fulfilling activities that everyone values. Lachs replies, the basic goods that Lee mentions are far from being universal, and we even lack a basis for attributing certain latent or potential tendencies to people who show no traces of them. Third, the view of dignity advanced by Dr. Lee is built on the difference between animals and humans, but humorously, Lachs says, anyone who thinks that animals lack the capacity to shape their lives has never lived with a cat, and so on for other animal behavior. The notion that individuals also in a persistent vegetative state retain the ability to make decisions, says Lachs, is a fiction. The fourth consideration is that Professor Lee announces that life is a basic good, and Lee says that one's life is identical with one's intrinsically valuable self, and it cannot be used as a means to relieve one's suffering. Well, Lachs replies to this by saying that this argument misrepresents what happens in suicide, because, as Lachs puts it, being alive is a neutral state that opens the door to both joy and misery. There's nothing morally wrong with eliminating a condition that leads to constant suffering. So he thinks of life as a condition of suffering and pleasure, not as a means to suffering and pleasure. So it's this emphasis on the difference between the idea of means and the idea of condition. Fifth, Lee maintains that comparisons are impossible when they deal with the consequences of continued existence, but this is a surprising argument, says Lachs. It declares impossible what we do many times each day when we evaluate the comparisons of the good and bad consequences of our actions. Sixth, and finally, Professor Lee's world is crowded, he says, with beings that can never lose their characteristic features. But Lachs replies, unfortunately, because corrosive change is at the heart of everything, we cannot find any substantial beings. We are in a world populated by flux, not a world populated by individuals that don't change some of their features. And he has a couple poetic finishes to the article when he says, the earth is moving under our feet, and the sky is too cloudy to steer by distant stars. What was once right is now questionable. What was once good no longer satisfied. And later he says, what have never even been conceived in prior centuries now face us as urgent problems, and we have no one to turn to for help but ourselves. Now, we'll talk about this more in the commentary section on this